pawn to a4, pawn to a5, and now pawn to f4, the famous King's Gambit. At first glance, this might look like a bad opening. After all, white is giving up a pawn and weakening the diagonal toward the king. But let's see what actually happens in one of the earliest recorded games featuring this opening, played in 1560. In that game, the black player did not capture the pawn on f4. Instead, he played pawn to d6. White continued with bishop to c4, developing actively, and black responded with pawn to c6. Then came knight to f3, and now black pinned the knight with bishop to g4. At this point, white played a strong move. Pawn takes a5. Black recaptured with pawn takes a5, and now a brilliant tactical idea appears. Here we introduce the concept of hanging pieces, a theme often taught in tactical lessons. A hanging piece is one that is undefended or poorly protected. In this case, the bishop on g4. White took advantage of this with a stunning combination. Bishop takes f7, check. After king takes f7, white strikes with knight takes e5, a double attack on both the king and the bishop on g4. Black retreated with king to e8, and now white simply played queen takes g4, winning material. Black tried to continue with knight to f6, but white delivered queen to e6, check. Black could not block with bishop to e7, since that would lead to checkmate in one move. Therefore, black was forced to play queen to e7. White calmly followed with queen to c8, check, and the only defense was queen to d8. The winning move is queen captures queen, which comes with check, forcing the black king's reply and luring the queen to d8. Next comes knight to f7, a double attack on the king and rook, and white wins easily. Now let's look at the second historical game from 1620, again played by Greco with the white pieces. He opened with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and pawn to f4, the classic King's Gambit. Black has two main options: accept the gambit with pawn takes f4, or decline it by developing with bishop to c4 or counterattacking with pawn to d5, the Falkbeer counter gambit. However, the most challenging and most popular response is to accept the gambit with pawn takes f4. White's main idea is clear. By playing pawn to f4, he opens lines for his bishop and rook. The plan continues with bishop captures f4, then knight development, followed by bishop to c4, and finally castling short. After these normal developing moves, the c-file often becomes open, allowing white to create strong pressure, especially targeting the f7 square, one of the weakest points in black's camp. However, white must be careful not to push pawn to d4 too early, because if he does, black can reply with a check, forcing the white king to move to e2, which is far from ideal. Of course, the King's Gambit is perfectly playable, and if I'm not mistaken, even Paul Morphy and later Bobby Fischer explored this variation at different times. In this position, there are two main ways for white to continue. One option is to play knight to f3 immediately, preparing to push pawn to d4 next. Black cannot truly prevent this central advance. It's coming no matter what. The second approach is to develop the bishop first, with ideas of playing bishop to c4 before bringing out the knight. In that line, white is saying that even if black checks with queen to h4, he can calmly move the king to f1, nothing disastrous happens, and development continues smoothly. However, in this particular game, we'll focus on the main line with knight to f3. Black responds with pawn to g5, defending the f4 pawn but losing valuable time in the process. White now plays bishop to c4, and black pushes further with pawn to g4. At this point, white strikes back with knight to e5, and immediately we can see the tactical pressure building. The pawn on g4 is under attack, and so is the f7 pawn, the weakest point in black's camp. Black quickly realizes that white's development is far superior. Two active minor pieces already developed, while black has only gained a pawn but no real coordination. Trying to create counterplay, black plays queen to h4, giving check. White calmly responds with king to f1, stepping out of danger, and black continues with knight to f6 to defend. At this moment, you might wonder, what if instead of that, black tries knight to h6, hoping to protect the pawn on g4 and reinforce his structure? Let's explore that next. Here, black may claim to be a pawn up, but white has excellent development and strong compensation. After pawn to d4, all of white's pieces come to life. The center is powerful, the knights have good squares, and white is already threatening pawn to f4 to open lines. This active piece play is exactly what makes the King's Gambit so dangerous. Black continues with knight to c6, and white can simply recapture the pawn. If black tries knight takes e5, white responds with knight takes e5, attacking both the rook and the f7 pawn. The material becomes equal, but white's activity gives a clear advantage. To avoid this, black might instead play pawn to d6, but then knight captures c6, followed by pawn takes c6. Now pawn to c3 stabilizes the position, giving white a solid center and flexible options. From here, white can continue naturally, developing the bishop to g3, or starting an attack with queen to b3, creating a battery toward f7, or even playing queen to a4 to increase the pressure. Overall, despite being temporarily down a pawn, white's coordination and attacking chances make this a clearly favorable position. In the king's gambit, it's quite common for the white king to stay on f1 for a while. This isn't dangerous. In fact, black has no real way to attack the king. In return, white enjoys excellent central control and active piece development, which more than compensates for the slightly exposed king. Returning to this particular game, after king to f1, black continued with knight to f6. White responded with a powerful bishop takes f7, forcing king to d8, followed by pawn to d4. Black struck back with knight takes e4, suddenly threatening checkmate in one move. White calmly defended with queen to e2, attacking the knight. Black countered with knight to g3, forking the king, queen, and rook. White had no choice but to capture. Pawn takes g3, after which queen takes h1, check. The sequence continued. King to f2, queen to g3, check. King takes g3, and queen takes c1. At first glance, it looks like black is winning after capturing a rook, but appearances are deceiving. It's white's move, and there's a brilliant winning combination. Knight to c6, check. This move opens the e-file, and after knight takes c6, white finishes with a beautiful checkmate on e8. Let's move on to another example. And you might be thinking that the king's gambit is just an opening for amateurs. But that's not true at all. Even top grandmasters have played it. Here's a fantastic modern game between Ruslan Ponomaryov and Lanier Dominguez, both rated over 2,700. The game began with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and, of course, pawn to f4, the king's gambit. Black accepted with pawn takes f4, and white continued with knight to f3, preventing the annoying queen to h4 check. Black advanced with pawn to g5, and white countered in the center with pawn to d4. After bishop to g7, solidly defending, white developed further with knight to c3, followed by pawn to d6. Now came a key move, pawn to g3. This is a classic king's gambit idea. White aims to challenge the f4 pawn and weaken black's pawn chain. Once the pawn on f4 falls, the knight, bishop, and even the queen can all target the g5 pawn, creating strong kingside pressure. Black tried to maintain the structure with pawn to g4, but white calmly replied knight to h4, attacking the pawn chain directly. Black pushed again with pawn to f3, which looks threatening at first, but in reality, white's king remains perfectly safe. White can easily bring the king to f2, maintaining a solid position and powerful center, ready to launch a kingside attack. It's not easy for black to deal with white's active knight on h4. For instance, after bishop to e3, black might try to attack it, but white can respond dynamically, even sacrificing another pawn. If bishop takes h4, then pawn takes h4, followed by queen takes h4, and bishop to f2, attacking the queen. Now white has excellent control of the dark squares, strong central dominance, and easy development. The knight can jump to d5, and white can castle long, launching a quick attack. For example, after queen to e8, white castles long, and if pawn to c6 tries to stop knight to d5, white can strike immediately with pawn to e5, opening the e-file and creating attacking chances. That's why black avoided bishop to f6. Instead, the game continued knight to c6, queen to d2, and pawn to h5. White calmly castled long, and after knight g to a7 came a brilliant positional move, the key idea of this setup. White aimed to break down black's pawn chain and completely open the position. After bishop to d7, white played bishop to c4, completing development. Now the position is a dream for white. All pieces are active, there's pressure on the g4 pawn, a dominant center, and the potential to push pawn and knight to f5 or bring a rook to the e-file. Meanwhile, black's biggest problem remains. He cannot castle, and his pieces are cramped. This is exactly why the king's gambit remains such a dangerous and exciting weapon, even at the highest levels. Thanks for watching.